July 6th, 2017. The Splat Brella was revealed during the Splatoon 2 Direct, introducing everyone to a new weapon type planned shortly after the game's release. 2 months later, on September 13th, 2017, the Tenta Brella was announced during a Nintendo Direct, bringing a heavyweight version of the Brella with a bigger and stronger canopy. And just like clockwork, on November 21st, 2017, the Undercover Brella briefly snuck its way into the Splatoon 2 version 2.0 trailer, showing off a Brella that could fire while also raising the shield. These 3 make up the Brella class of weapons, which eventually made their way into Splatoon 3, alongside many of the other returning weapons. The main appeal of these weapon types are the shields they each have, able to block various amounts of damage and allow them to get close to dish out their own. However, nowadays these 3 are seen as contenders for some of the worst weapons in the game, especially now that Splatoon 3 has brought new players into the series. As someone who has been with the series since Splatoon 1, and has seen the growth of the Brella weapons in Splatoon 2, allow me to share my thoughts on these weapons in Splatoon 3. Today, we'll analyze why the 3 major players in one of Splatoon's many weapon classes ended up being overlooked and mocked by many. This is the tragedy of the Brella class. Before I talk about each Brella individually, I should probably explain what led us here. Why exactly are these 3 now seen as contenders for some of the worst weapons in the game? To find that answer, you must go back to Splatoon 2. During the game's lifetime, the Brellas received some pretty steady buffs at first. Things such as resistances to certain weapon types, decreasing the intervals between the Brella actually opening, and even squashed a few issues that found their way into the weapon. However, at some point, it soon became Nerf City. The Splat Brella and Tenta Brella found aspects being reduced quite heavily, from damage, Brella health and resistance, points to fill special, and much more. The Undercover Brella may have gotten off easy with only receiving more buffs throughout its lifetime, but the weapon was still fairly weak, despite all of the changes. We'll get into that much later. So imagine taking weapons that were heavily weakened from multiple patches and plopping them into a new game with new mechanics and weapons. As a result, many players both old and new were able to see how weak the weapons were outright, especially when the game's latency issues were factored in. Despite so many players clamoring for buffs to the weapons, so far has been nothing but minor fixes, which are nice, but do nothing to help in the current landscape. Since all of this begins with Splatoon 2, let's take a look at the patch notes and history of each weapon. Now, I will be using Wikipedia for my explanations in terms of buffs, nerfs, and other miscellaneous info, mostly because A, I don't have footage of how those weapons worked long ago, and B, it's backed up with sources such as the official patch notes. Also, if you're hoping for me to go in depth on how to use each of the Brellas or their playstyles, I sadly will be skipping that. You're talking to someone who plays nothing but Turf War all day, so I don't have any knowledge on how the weapons handle in the competitive scene. Even if I did have the capacity to talk about it, explaining how each of them worked would take quite a while. If you want someone who does look at it in terms of competitive, feel free to give this Dr. Fish guy a watch, or really any videos of these 3 weapons. Anyway, that's enough stalling. It's time we take a look at our first victim, the Splat Brella. The Splat Brella is the first Brella weapon released for the game, setting the stage for Brella weapons as a whole. While it was available in the single-player mode of Splatoon 2 on release, the weapon wouldn't be available in multiplayer until August 12th. The first major change for the weapon would be version 1.4.0, around October 2017, which introduced a pretty solid set of buffs for the weapon, such as decreasing the time required to open the Brella and even increasing the movement speed while doing so, making the use of run speed up a pretty effective strategy of sorts. It also allowed the Brella to handle the Baller special a bit more, which was quite a nuisance during the early days of Splatoon 2. So overall, a solid set of buffs and fixes for the weapon to help it stand against the competition, with the only notable nerf being a 20-point increase to fill the special gauge, which wasn't so bad with how well the weapon covered already. However, once the 2.1.0 update came out in December of 2017, everything went downhill from there. Narrowed area painted with a single shot, which they would somewhat revert months later. Ink consumption per shot increased by 1.35%, increased damage to the canopy from blaster and charger weapons. And of course, the constant changes to the amount of points needed to fill the special gauge, which honestly seems like someone being indecisive on which one it should be. The final nail in the coffin would be the 5.3.0 patch in July of 2020, which decreased the Splat Brella's overall damage. How the Splat Brella worked, or really how all the Brella weapons work for that matter, is that they fired pellets of ink like a shotgun. The Splat Brella in particular fired 6 pellets per shot, though apparently it would only register 5 of them when dealing damage. Don't ask me, it's listed in the wiki. This patch would change the maximum damage of each of these pellets from 18 to 16.2. This meant the Brella could no longer hit 90 damage point blank, but instead 81. Now, why is this a big deal? 1.8 less damage doesn't sound so bad, plus 81 damage off of a single shot is still pretty strong, especially when it combined with the popular trick of having the enemy touch the shield. It's important to remember that you might not always land every pellet with each shot, since the pellets do deviate from the barrel like a shotgun would, meaning if you're off by a hair and aren't at the right distance, the damage can change wildly, which is something that is going to happen in a game with so many movement mechanics. This is why many people often feel the damage is very inconsistent with these weapons, and honestly, I don't blame them. In fact, the pellets decrease in damage if they travel long enough as well, which means a potential 2-shot can turn into 3 or 4, maybe even more. Thankfully, the nerf wasn't bad enough to cripple the weapon entirely, but a big change to damage like that certainly didn't help matters, especially if, say, the weapon is brought into a new environment with squid rolls, 2 new weapon classes, and a whole slew of new special weapons. The damage is also notable in Splatoon 3 as the kit originally had Inkstorm, which allowed the user to fight enemies within the storm to secure easy splats. With Splatoon 3 replacing Inkstorm with Triple Ink Strike for some odd reason, many players lost both a strong combo tool and a useful special for covering turf. Though it is at least nice that the Triple Ink Strike was recently buffed, making it a pretty strong weapon to use in the right hands. Overall, the Splat Brella is in a decent spot as is. Not perfect of course, but I can say it's in a better shape than our next 2 victims. Speaking of which, with the Splat Brella covered, let's take a look at our next victim. One that I have tried to put more time into than I'm proud of. The Tenta Brella was the next Brella weapon to be released, finding its way into the September 2017 Nintendo Direct before releasing later that month on the 30th. This is a heavyweight version of the Splat Brella, trading its overall speed for more power and a larger shield. And when I say power, I meant this weapon could deal 120 damage point blank, enough to splat opponents in a single shot. Emphasis on could, seeing as the first major change would be increasing the maximum damage of each pellet, going from 15 to 17.5, so 7 pellets times 17.5 equals 122 damage. Fortunately, there's no extra pellets with this one, and all 7 pellets will register if they land. Emphasis on if. As for the next few patches, they would bring various changes to how the canopy shield worked. Instead of being forced to hold this extremely large shield for a long time to launch it, allowing enemies to simply swim around and attack the user, it was extremely fast to launch it forward and trail behind it. This change, while small at first, shaped the way that the Tenta Brella would work from now on, as it meant you could create moving barriers to protect yourself and allies as you advance. The first major nerf the weapon would receive was in version 2.0.0, where the canopy would remain active for 6 seconds instead of 8, though they did balance this out by adding a buff which made the canopy regenerate much faster, going from 9 seconds down to 6, just about as long as it takes for the Brella shield to disappear. So unlike the Splat Brella where we received nothing but nerfs on version 2.1.0, for the Tenta Brella, this wouldn't happen until 4.0.0 in September 2018. With the first set of nerfs being small at first, just some more points to fill special changes as per usual, though it eventually moved on to bigger ones such as changing the health of the canopy shield. This one was rather scary since all weapons have their own multipliers when attacking the shield. So when version 4.3.0 made it receive 20% more damage from attacks after being launched, for a weapon that has been buffed to be able to launch much faster and more often, this definitely meant that the right weapons could delete the shield if it wanted. This would also be paired with a decrease in the Brella shield's maximum HP, so instead of the 800 health it was proud of, now it was 700. There were some other changes such as reducing the damage of each pellet by 0.5, as well as giving 1% additional ink consumption when firing, but on the surface the Tenta Brella survived and came out on the other end a little shaken, but still intact. And hey, it came out with a pretty strong ability to launch powerful shields much faster. Unfortunately, the shield was the only major thing that saw constant tweaks. The actual weapon itself was still fairly weak in a number of areas. For starters, actually fighting in close range engagements, which is surprising considering I did mention this thing can one-shot at point blank. Though once you remember how aim and distance affects the way pellets hit enemies, you can see why a potential one-shot can quickly turn into 2 at best, making it easy to be rushed down by almost every weapon if possible, and usually allowing the enemy time to retaliate and delete you instead if you were to flank them. Oh, and unlike the Splat Brella, you can't just hold the shield out on the wind between shots. There's a very long delay to go through after all. Even if you were fast enough to deploy it and somehow survive the latency issues, you can only hold the shield for less than 2 seconds before it flies off. And if you're wondering if the kit does anything to help with these matters, no. The Tenta Brella is designed to be a support weapon first and foremost. As a result, the kits for it were hyper-focused on support whenever possible, which gave the Tenta Brella no other options to help itself when fighting. You're intended to fight with your team rather than fighting alone, which I find quite ridiculous in a game with only 2 communication commands on hand. The base Tenta Brella has squid beacons and bubble blower, which already look concerning, since its only alternative option for encounters are bubbles that can be destroyed or ignored in many ways. The Tenta Brella is even worse though, with Splash Wall and Curling Bomb Launcher, a sub-weapon that replicates what the main weapon already does, except weaker, stationary, and more ink-hungry, as well as not helping with the weapon's lack of range, alongside a special that requires being on the ground and throwing curling bombs non-stop, which can be easily avoided by just swimming away from it or up a wall. The Tenta Camo Brella was fortunate to get ink mines and ultra stamp at the very least, but the low ink capabilities mixed with the 210 points needed to fill the special gauge really hurt it. All of this is a fancy way to say that Splatoon 3 having squid beacons and ink vac on Tenta Brella isn't surprising, and both it and the already weak stats of the main weapon itself show why it struggles in many areas. They're still adamant about pushing this as a support weapon in a game that lacks communication, and whether you'll get a team to work with your shield or not is a roll of the slots. Before I kick this thing while it's down though, let's move on to our last victim of today, a weapon so weak that people consider it the worst weapon in the entire game. The Undercover Brella is the last Brella weapon made for Splatoon 2, releasing on December 30th, 2017. This was meant to be a lightweight version of sorts, having the ability to fire the weapon rather quickly while also holding out the shield. The catch, however, would be that the shield would be extremely weak, only having 200 HP, unlike the Splat Brella's 500 or the Tenta Brella's 700. Oh, and a much lower damage output, of course. While the idea of the weapon was rather unique, players soon realized that this was a rather terrible weapon. In fact, its introduction was worse in Splatoon 2 than in Splatoon 3. I wish I was kidding, seeing as it was a short-range weapon with a weak shield to boot. So weak in fact that some players would throw a single bomb at it to immediately destroy it, before spotting the user that was unprotected. While Splat bombs normally deal 180 damage if caught in the blast, the Undercover Brella has its own unique multipliers when the shield receives damage, so on paper the shield should survive the explosion and just leave the enemy with less ink. But the table says Splat bombs need to deal 2 times damage, so... Speaking of damage, the Undercover Brella was extremely weak. In the early days, it could potentially deal 7 damage minimum, the lowest damage possible in the game. This is because, like the other Brella weapons, the Undercover operates with pellets, with it firing 4 pellets that each deal 10 damage, meaning the maximum damage you could deal was 40, which was nice, and considering the faster fire rate and ability to fire while holding the shield out, sounds fine. Though like the other Brellas before it, it's easy for this damage to become inconsistent, seeing as the damage will still decrease if it travels long enough, and you only have 4 pellets to work with. Which is exactly how most players were able to see how weak the weapon was, when what should be a 3-hit splat suddenly turns into 10 or more at worst. As you can probably tell, the Undercover Brella was in a pretty tough spot. Its only saving grace was the fact that it covered turf much more effectively while staying protected. It wouldn't be until July 2018, more than half a year after the weapon's release, that a major buff would happen with the 3.2.0 patch. This patch made it so that if the Undercover Brella splats an opponent, or receives an assist, the canopy shield will be immediately repaired back to full. That's right, the major defining feature of the Undercover Brella in Splatoon 3 wouldn't become a staple in Splatoon 2 until 7 months after the weapon was released. Anyhow, this was a real game changer for the weapon, even allowing it to potentially stand against more opponents quickly. Not only that, but it allowed the ink mine that the Undercover Brella had to stand out, since you could use the tracking capabilities to secure assists. Despite the unique buff made to the weapon though, it was still in a pretty tough spot for many years, even to this day. But how can that be? Look at how many buffs were made to the weapon. That is true, until you see what those buffs were made for. The next buff would increase the maximum damage of each pellet from 10 to 12, meaning instead of 40 damage maximum, it would deal 48 maximum. Yay! At least, that would have been the case. But they made it so that if it deals over 40 damage, it would cap at 40 as per usual. The last few buffs on the other hand focused on main power-up, an ability introduced late into the life of Splatoon 2, which would change certain aspects of each weapon. For the Undercover Brella, it would increase the speed at which the canopy regenerates, which could prove useful if you're willing to build gear around it. However, as I'm sure you're aware, main power-up is not in Splatoon 3, and as such, these buffs mean nothing for the weapon as we know now. Therefore, the only major buff to the weapon is the one from 3.2.0, the patch which gave the Undercover Brella its now iconic ability. So the amount of progress made for the weapon was strong, but couldn't be carried over to Splatoon 3, and as such, it has received little to no progress in making it strong enough to survive certain encounters. The best thing that came out of the Undercover Brella outside of the shield regeneration were the new variants of Splatoon 2, which as I'm sure you're aware have not yet been implemented in Splatoon 3. Therefore, no splat bombs or torpedoes to speak of. Now that I've talked about all three Brellas and their various patches, I think you can see why they ended up in the state they're in at the moment. The Splat Brella, while still intact, had been tweaked quite heavily in a number of areas, even having its original playstyles altered slightly in Splatoon 3. The Tenta Brella, while still fairly strong after all the nerfs, was rather weak to begin with, as the weapon itself struggled to cover turf or engage enemies for years. Combined their focus on adjusting the shield and the hyperfocus on making it a support weapon meant that none of the kits or patches would address these issues. Finally, the Undercover Brella suffered from buffs that focused in areas that Splatoon 3 couldn't use, as main power-up was dropped, and for a lot of people, myself included, was music to our ears. But it also meant that issues like the shield being weaker than tissue paper couldn't be fixed through this way, and as such, the Undercover Brella remained the same as it was in version 4.1.0. A version of Splatoon 2 that was released 5 years ago. The only weapon that I can say has truly survived was the Splat Brella, especially since it's still quite reliable despite the nerfs made to the weapon, whereas the Tenta Brella is in a pretty tough spot, and I should know having played the weapon a ton. Now there are many who say that the Undercover Brella is the worst of the three, in fact possibly the worst weapon in the entire game. While I do agree that the feelings are warranted, my vote goes to the Tenta Brella being the worst instead. Remember that the Tenta Brella is designed to be a support weapon first and foremost, and is difficult to utilize depending on the map, team synergy, enemy team synergy, and much more. Also, in a game where the goal is to cover turf, this has the worst inking capabilities of the three, with the only way to get more being to constantly launch shields, which I don't need to explain why that's a bad idea. Not to mention the sub and special weapon doesn't give it a means of pressuring enemies, unlike the Undercover Brella which does have that luxury. In a vacuum, I say Undercover Brella is definitely the worst in terms of the main weapons, especially when you factor in the potential damage you can deal, or lack thereof. When looking at the weapons as a whole, aka the entire kit itself, Tenta Brella takes the cake. A very stale cake, that is. The problem with trying to fix all the Brella weapons is that it can't just be a simple damage buff. Unless your name is the Undercover Brella, of course. These weapons have been tweaked in multiple ways over the years to put them in the state they're in, so messing with one aspect may collapse the tower that these weapons have been built on. If one was to suggest changes, my first goal would be revise the damage multiplier a little, especially when it comes to the Undercover Brella and its measly 200 HP. Making it so bombs deal their normal damage means the user has to follow it up in order to break the shield, making it much more risky for the enemy as they're without a bomb for a moment. And the Undercover Brella I feel should also have its maximum damage increased to 45. It's still a 3-hit splat at best, but can pair nicely with the Ink Mine with the base kit. This is just a small handful of possible changes I was able to come up with, and there isn't a guarantee it'll work out. At the end of the day though, any buffs that fix the major flaws are a nice start. Splatoon 2 has already introduced variants of all 3 Brella types, so the idea of trying to make my own kinda feels unnecessary. But, given I'm afraid of Tenta Brella getting Splash Roll again, I think we should do something. So for now, let's just pretend for a moment I was in the driver's seat of deciding the next weapon kits. For the Splat Brella, I would personally go for Fizzy Bomb and Big Bubbler, since if you're rewarded 81 damage point blank, but the enemy tries to run away, you can use a quick Fizzy Bomb alongside it. This is nice, but it also adds risks since holding the Brella shield drains ink, so this combo is mighty ink hungry, but effective in the right hands. It also means the Splat Brella has an option against enemies behind walls or barriers, even just enemies who are out of your effective range. As for the Big Bubbler, it provides a barrier to use in conjunction with the Brella shield, and can even help the Splat Brella when it comes to being stationary. If any Brella should get the Big Bubbler, I think it's the one that can already manage on its own in the right hands. For the Tenta Brella, Suction Bomb and Killer Whale 5.1 would be amazing. Suction Bombs mean that you can throw bombs onto important spots to pressure enemies or halt approaches, especially if using it in conjunction with the Killer Whale 5.1. Or, you can potentially use it to counter rival Tenta Brellas from rushing in with their own shield, especially if you threaten to throw a Suction Bomb at the shield and blow them up. Killer Whale 5.1 goes through walls and can be used to pressure enemies trying to hide behind them. Plus, it immediately refills your ink tank after potentially throwing a bomb or deploying the shield, which can be extremely useful with how ink hungry the weapon is. The cherry on top is that it also gets charges and splatlinks moving, while potentially ruining their charge, which is always a plus. And lastly, for the Undercover Brella, I would go for Torpedo and Crab Tank. Torpedo and Undercover Brella can work as a pressure tool of sorts, limiting the enemy's mobility and forcing them to choose their targets wisely. Plus, one torpedo and a quick burst of the Undercover Brella means an instant splat at times, especially if the droplets come in and save the day. It's also possible to ruin a rival Undercover Brella's shield since torpedoes deal 4 times damage against them. Crab Tank seems like an odd choice, but it does allow the Undercover Brella to pressure chargers, as well as offer an additional shield of sorts to hide behind if the canopy breaks. Now this is just a small selection of the potential sets I could think of while working on this video. There are definitely some other crazy ideas like Splat Brella with Toxic Mist and Zipcaster, Tenta Brella with Angle Shooter and Tenta Missiles, or even Undercover Brella with Auto Bomb and Tactical Alert. You could even incorporate some elements of the older sets to make some really awesome weapons. I just wanted to throw in some ideas in as per usual. I mean, it does get people talking after all, and allows me to see what other people think. Plus, I just really hate thinking about Tenta Brella with Splash Wall. Like, no, please, I don't want to see it again. No more. Well friends, that's the current story of the Brella class of weapons. A sad tale indeed for such a neat concept birthed by the minds of Nintendo. Fortunately, there is still time for them to fix this tragedy from becoming set in stone in Splatoon 3. With some proper weapon kits and some much needed changes, these 3 should be able to stand out on their own once again. For now though, that's this case done and dusted. What are your thoughts on the Brella weapons as a whole? What do you think led them to the state they're in now? And do you think there's a way for these 3 to climb back up the ranks? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you wish to see more videos in this style, or really, Splatoon videos in general, feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next time. Until we meet again.